Yup, she's back. Are any of you voting to listen to the snake instead of the disembodied voice? And really, I wouldn't blame you. One of the benefits of making it to junior year was supposed to be getting away from the disembodied voice. So let's consider this an experiment. Your theology teacher and I got to talking about how many of you had taken AP Art History, and I offered to try my hand at lectures on how the sacraments are portrayed in art. Since you're starting with baptism, so am I. We can all see how it goes. This will not be a theology lecture, by the way. I chose these works to provoke thought, discussion, and maybe even a little shock. I wasn't, as you'll see. You might even describe the choices as rather random. Anyway, on to the works. Once upon a time, this was one of our art history required works. The link here is better than the one I used for class since it shows the works side by side. Anyway, watch the first minute or so as a refresher. In my lecture on video art, I noted that Viola was a student of Zen Buddhism, and then I posed these questions. What religious symbolism do we see in this piece? What might be the meaning of water and fire? What does the title "The Crossing" mean, anyway? Are we seeing a person annihilating himself? Being reborn? Both? And let me add for this year one new question. Why might this be the first image I'm sticking into an art history lecture on baptism? Well, what I didn't tell you when I lectured on The Crossing, probably because I didn't know, is that 2 of his multi-screen videos have been permanently installed in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and that Viola's works have appeared in churches all over the world. In fact, my son Sam just reminded me that we actually saw The Crossing many years ago in the Palace of the Popes at Avignon. Here are images of one of these installations. Note the reappearance of Viola's favorite themes, water and fire. Here's another Viola installation. I couldn't find a good video, but here is a description from the Whitney Gallery in New York, which exhibited this work. Quote, "The central focus is water in its historical, psychological, and spiritual dimensions. 5 individual video images are projected simultaneously onto various walls within a dark room. In each projection, a clothed man plunges into a pool of water. The figure is submerged in or reemerges from the water, at times diving into the surface or hovering over it in a continuous loop of differing sequences." But what really intrigued me was Viola's own description of this work. I want you to listen to a clip from an interview with the artist. I hope you'll pause afterward and share your own reactions to his statement before the disembodied voice chimes in. Well, I hope I'm not scandalizing your theology teacher when I say this, but I thought Viola's comments about the physical side of spirituality, quote, birth and death and sex and eating, unquote, were actually a pretty good introduction to the sacraments. You all recognize this painter, right? My man crush, Caravaggio. The Death of the Virgin, the painting on the right, caused a real scandal. The nuns who commissioned it sent it back. They thought the Virgin looked, well, just too dead. And remember the Last Supper with the guinea pig and Judas, whose face was Pizarro's? Indeed, the sheer physicality of the Christian sacraments shocked many Romans, and they were not easily shocked. Eating flesh, drinking blood, the 2 shall become one flesh. We're getting ahead of our story. Back to baptism. Some of the very earliest Christian art appears in the Roman catacombs. The work on the left portrays a baptism and there's some dispute among scholars about this, may portray the baptism of Christ. I could not find an explanation for the winged creature, and I tried. So, any guess about the figure on the right? What biblical narrative is that frame depicting? I'll give you a hint. This image circled in red on the right is a very early depiction of the baptism of Christ, with Christ interestingly portrayed as a child. What 2 stories do you see depicted on the left, circled in purple? So here you see those images on the left blown up. Does it help? Well, above we see animals leaving Noah's Ark, and below Jonah being swallowed by the fish. Note how much Jonah looks like a classical Greek statue. The figure on the right, believe it or not, is Noah and his ark. So, why are Noah and Jonah juxtaposed with Christ's baptism? Okay, both involve getting dunked in water, but I think the early Christians saw a more profound link between the flood and baptism. You may remember this Jewish painter. I talked about his White Crucifixion, which Pope Francis has identified as his favorite painting. So what does Marc Chagall highlight in this work that doesn't show up in most Bible story illustrations, given to children at least? Well, he shows us light and hope and dead people. Lots of dead people. Jonah's sojourn in the fish's belly is likewise about death as well as rebirth. This is a 20th century woodcut print. Remember Kathy Kollwitz? Here's a Flemish oil painting. You gotta love the fish's face. And here's how a contemporary artist has captured Jonah's despair and maybe interjected a note of hope for rebirth. And here is still another Old Testament story that the early church often depicted alongside images of baptism. It's another 20th century Marc Chagall painting. What story is it telling? Well, St. Paul offers a hint in 1 Corinthians. It's the crossing of the Red Sea. Since I found them, I'll throw in a few more images of this biblical story that Paul associates so closely with baptism. Note the lack of squeamishness about the juxtaposition of death and rebirth. And here, interestingly, is an abstract expressionist crossing of the Red Sea. So does the red represent the sea or death and destruction? And I couldn't resist. I thought you'd enjoy this one. It's from an underground bar in London filled with religious art. Here again is the crossing of the Red Sea and a close-up. Note that I'm mostly leaving the theology of baptism to your theology teacher, but this art raises a question in my mind. Have we become too squeamish about the death part of death and rebirth? Are we missing an important part of the story? And speaking of traditions that we have abandoned, most scholars believe that in the early church, Christian converts were baptized in the nude. By the way, catechists were also instructed not to bathe for several days before baptism, which must have made baptisms, especially baptisms in the rather tight space of the catacombs, rather pungent affairs. And it wasn't because people didn't take baths back then. This was Rome. They loved baths. We don't see a lot of nude Christs, by the way, but again, scholars think that Christ probably was baptized in the nude. Here is the same scene from Giotto's frescoes in the Scrovegni Chapel, another of our old required works. Neither the mosaic artist nor Giotto was trying to shock or titillate the men and women praying in these chapels. Instead, I think their works convey a spiritual message that, again, we may sometimes lose, a message that baptism brings us to God vulnerable and open to reclothing in the Spirit. I'm going to stop here so that I don't choke YouTube and resume in the second part of this lecture.